And so my desks are all spread out. Don't worry about it today, but when we get all, is this 21 in my heydays?
That's quite good.
It's such a weird mix having that many below the letter L. We'll figure out a seating chart when it comes, so don't worry about it. So I got to spread everyone out. My third period has 29, I think. That's why I moved my desk, so I put 3 more desks here. But everyone's spread out now. But I did not want plexiglass. I really did not want plexiglass for lots of reasons. But have you been in the class yet that's got the plexiglass? People sitting in the desk, obviously are reflections of themselves. My favorite part about the plexiglass is I talked to a couple of elementary school teachers, like first, second, third grade, and the kids just can't quit either licking it or blowing it and making faces. That's all they can do. It's like irresistible. They can't stop. And I'm thinking, I bet there'd be a lot of people any age doing that.
Yeah.
But it's that's a stuff in the hallway of it. I also see that someone tripping and being impaled on it. That also worries me a lot too. And so, because it would be a mess. All right, moving on. Covered a lot on Friday. Oh, and then the Espionage Act I assigned. It's the last page of this packet, and it's a law. It's an amazing law. And so there's some questions about it. You have to look up what espionage is, or you might already know, but you have to make sure you know. And it's an unbelievable law that was passed in the United States during the war. It shows you what war madness will do. And so that will be due on Tuesday. And so let's go ahead then, and I got to scroll back. This is hard for me to talk about. I know World War I fascinates me. And so I got to skip things because there's too much. So I got to figure out what's important, what has direct effect on the United States. But that's why I told you about the battles of Tannenberg and the Marne. Those two battles, Americans were not even involved at all, and they would directly affect the United States to this day. I told you another battle like that. Remember the Battle of Quebec, where the British drove the French out of New France? That same kind of thing. Americans really weren't even involved. But it would affect, the United States wasn't even in the country at Quebec. By the way, Tannenberg would convince what country to stay in the war, even though clearly their plans had failed. Yeah, Germany stayed in the war. Foolish mistake. The Marne would convince what two countries to stay in the war. Yeah, Britain and France stayed in the war. And Russia made the determination, we're going to stand up for our allies. And it would destroy the Russian Empire. It would change everything. Just such an amazing turn of events. And so, this is what I talked about them trying to widen the war. We had stalemate. Talked about Big Bertha. And so the Central Powers is they're basically going to be 4 countries. By the end of the war, most of Europe, or most of the world, most of the independent countries of the world will be allies. So Germany is going to be greatly outnumbered. And when I talk about the Central Powers, it's basically Germany. They're the power, they make the decisions. So going into 1915 then, Germany. Going into 1915, so this is 1915. Germany, surrounded, outnumbered, they make the decision, and it's a logical decision if you consider if you're going to stay in the war. What is it? Hold out in the West. Dig deep in that area of France and Belgium that they conquered. Dig deep on the high ground. If you dig trenches, you don't need as many men to defend. And then take the extra soldiers and knock Russia out. Knock them out. And don't forget, Serbia give me a sec. Oh, I got a vote on my union contract. Kind of a big deal. One thing I've noticed since, I bet you guys are the same way. Once we stop doing all this stuff online, are you just inundated with emails and messages? From like teachers and various things? I've gotten so many emails and I'm missing them. Or they're going to my clutter and I'll never know they're there. And stuff like that. That's me whining. But do you feel better for me? Do I get sympathy at all? No, I'm good. All right, so with that, and then not Serbia. Serbia survived. They drove back and even invaded Austria. Austria was absolutely humiliated. So what they did is, Germany's going to send a few troops there and knock them out. That's why they wanted Bulgaria to surround Serbia. The Allies are in bigger trouble. They have huge problems, the Allies. So the Allies are everybody fighting Germany and Austria and Bulgaria, Turkey. By the way, Turkey or the Ottoman Empire is interchangeable. More and more they started going by Turkey. Britain had to build up an army. Britain did not have a large army when the war began. So they're going to be a volunteer army, and that means they're going to have to take the volunteers, and you can't just simply, throw them a rifle and say, go, fight. It takes a long time to train an army. More importantly, you need officers, and especially like sergeants. If you don't have this, you can't fight, and they take a long time to train. So 1915 is going to be a year for Britain to build up enough soldiers. So France is still going to kind of be alone. They kept this secret from their people of their countries. In France and Britain, they both governments said, a little bit longer, we're going to win the war this year. There'll be a lot of sacrifice, a lot of death, but we'll win it this year. When they knew there's no way they could really do it until 1916. I mean, they hoped something would happen. The British have to build up an army. By the way, Britain would recruit soldiers, and they would go into like neighborhoods of big cities like London or small villages, and they would go to all the young men, so basically everybody 18 to 20, and they would have joined together as a group with all your, they would say, with all your pals. They called them pals regiments. So you have an entire unit of people that are all friends. They're all friends, all buddies together in one unit, all the young men in one neighborhood in one unit. And that might be good for morale. It might be good for unit cohesion with your friends. But I think you might see the problem. What if that regiment, that first regiment, would be the first out of the trenches, over the top, they call it, at a horrible battle like we'll see tomorrow in the video with Somme, and half are dead in that one regiment. Can you imagine what that would do to the neighborhood after the war? Where you basically have a generation where there's half the young men are gone and the rest are never the same. And it's going to be inconsistent. Not every regiment will happen like that. It's a terrible way to build an army. You don't want people from all one neighborhood in a unit or one city. I mean, look at it this way: you don't want members, like a bunch of brothers and sisters together in one unit. Is what happens if they all get killed in that one unit. You want to spread out. And then the ON got blocked out. Russia needs to build up weapons. The Russian industry is going to have to start massively producing weapons. And if you can see from this map, it's almost impossible for the Allies to get equipment to Russia. Turkey blocks off here, so Russia's got to do it themselves. You can't get weapons through the Baltic Sea because Germany will block here. Up here, it's frozen most of the year, and there's one rickety railroad all the way to the Pacific, so it's really hard to get supplies. It's called the Trans-Siberian Railroad, brand new railroad. And so Russia's got to do it themselves. So they're really not going to have weapons until 1916. There are severe shortages in 1915. A significant number of Russian soldiers aren't going to have rifles. And they're going to be told at a couple of these battles, pick up the weapons of men who had died. Can you imagine how hard that would be on morale? And then if they don't have enough to just defeat the Germans, attack them on the periphery. That's why they wanted the Italians. And they thought they could attack through here. Maybe come around here. That's why they thought, hey, we can knock out the Ottomans and have another route in here. That's why they attacked the colonies. Chip away at the enemy. But of course, that's not going to be enough to really win. Britain's going to want to try to do this in World War II, and it'll be a disaster. And so, what we have then are a number of fronts. That term is an invention of World War I. where both enemies face each other, most famously the front, the only one we really need to know for here, the Western Front. Trench lines from Switzerland to Belgium, to the North Sea. But now just listen to these. But let me give you the other fronts. So the Russian front, there's going to be a Romanian front, there's going to be a Balkan front, there's going to be an Italian front, there's going to be a Caucasus front, there's going to be a Palestinian front, there's going to be a Mesopotamian front. Do you get the point? It's going to be a wide war, spread everywhere. Meteorology was a brand new science. And you can imagine how important it would be to know the weather in case you're going to attack. You know, it's going to have a big storm. We don't want to attack when everything's mud. Brand new science. Meteorology, brand new. And so as weather forecasting became more important, they had to develop names for various phenomena of weather. And so the most important weather phenomenon is where you have a warm air mass run into a cool air mass. And that line of potential storms on that line, that's why they call it a front. That came from World War I, the front. So here, there's a warm air front coming. That's a World War I. Same. There's a lot of stuff that came out of World War I, but that's one that just seems so obvious when you start thinking about it. So, they have all these fronts. On the periphery, you don't need to write down Tarnow and Galice. This is the battle the Russians lost. But on the Russian front, in 1915, Germany decisively defeated the Russians. Decisively. The Austrians helped with this. It was a German operation. And it's right here. The Russians were routed. Foolish Russian advance while protecting their flanks. And in just a couple months, the Russians went from their front line being here, lost Warsaw, all the way to here. That's hundreds of miles. A couple hundred miles and hundreds of square miles. A decisive defeat. The only reason the Germans didn't advance further into Russia is because they didn't have enough men to hold it all. And they assumed logically Russia's defeated. They got to surrender after losing all of this. But Russia stayed in the war. So Russia is basically beaten, but they're not going to quit. So we're not done with Russia. But this will end the Russian Empire. Their decision to stay in the war. They stayed in the war to help the French win. But they also assumed that the French win, they'd have a good seat at the peace table. The Italian front. So that'd be another front that would open between, there's Italy and there's Austria and Hungary, right here. Let me go back 1, 2, this area right here. And the thought was that Italy could stretch the Austrians so thin that they would be forced to surrender. But these pictures show you the problem. Right here is the Julian Alps. Beautiful mountains of the Alps stretch this whole area here. So you have 14,000 feet, peaks with valleys that plunge, river valleys that are 1,000 feet below the mountain line. So it's just this incredibly rugged. I've not been there. I've heard it's just stunningly beautiful. Some of the most pretty, most spectacular mountains in the world. But you can imagine how difficult it would be to fight at 12,000 feet, fighting in glaciers. Those are Italians, those are Austrians. And the Italians tried to drive the Austrians back and took horrible casualties up in the mountains. The Italian army accused their men of cowardice and executed thousands of Italian soldiers. And then they were nearly knocked out of the war in 1917. The big thing about this is Italy entered the war and their army was just butchered. And those veterans, the resentment they would have after the war would lead to fascism, directly lead to fascism. And see, World War I is the gift that never quits giving. The war has ended over almost 103 years ago now. God, that's getting amazing to me. And it still affects us to this day. They just found 6 Italian soldiers that were entombed in the ice. Must have been by explosions. They were entombed in there from World War I. They just found them not this winter, but last winter. Yeah, it happens a lot. When I was in Berlin, they found four German soldiers or four German civilians that were entombed from Allied bombing in 1945. And then when I was in Berlin, that was 2013. So that's unreal, isn't it? So with that, what about the Ottomans? So the thought was the Ottomans or the Turks would be beaten back. And they, in fact, the Allies were kind of overjoyed. They could drive back in the Suez Canal. They could get up into this area of Europe. This is the Ottoman Empire by 1914. Part of Europe, and then what is now Turkey. This is Armenia, Kurdistan, Syria, and Palestine, all the way down here. And right to the edge of a place called Basra. A massive, massive empire. And there are a lot of different multi-ethnic groups who want to be independent. And so you don't have to write these down. I put down the three fronts. I put asterisks here. You don't need them, but I just want to show you on the map. Here, here, and here. Three big fronts. And the Italians have, or the Ottomans have. This is what you have to know. The Ottomans did better than anyone else. They lasted to the end of the war. You know, they didn't have any industry at all. They only could trust the Turkish soldiers. But you do need the Arab revolt. You need the Arab revolt. The British and French convinced the Arabs who lived there. They convinced them to rise up against the Ottomans, overthrow them, and then the British and French will give them independence. They can have their independent states. And so the Arabs rose up, and it was more of a guerrilla war that wasn't born in the side of the Ottomans. Helped the Allies a lot. Now, they didn't win, but they helped them. The British helped the most. There's a movie about the main British officer that helped them called Lawrence of Arabia. If you've ever seen that movie, it's a great movie. I just got to warn you, if you ever watch a great movie, Lawrence of Arabia really is amazing. It's about 4 hours long. Just warning you. But the movie's great. Anyways, here's the point. When the war ended, do you think the British and French meant what they said about independence? No. No, the British did not give them independence. And that is going to lead to a few problems in the Middle East that last to this day. Especially when the British wanted to secure oil for their navy. And they created a country out of 3 provinces of the Ottoman Empire that we today call Iraq. The British did it for oil. So there's problems coming down the road from this war. One more thing. When I showed you right here, they tried to break through right here to get to Russia, open a supply line, and they attacked this little finger of land. It's only a mile wide, this strait here. I call it Gallipoli. The British, the French, and using also Australian and New Zealanders, they attacked right here, and they didn't break through, and it would turn out to be just a slaughter for the Allies, a disaster. But this would also be the defining moment for Australia. When Australia, which were these separate provinces on this, this massive island / continent, this kind of unified them into one country. This area right here, it's hollowed ground for Australia today. I guess thousands of Australian tourists go to Gallipoli every year to this day. So that's the shore of Gallipoli. We can't talk much more about it, but the point is they couldn't break through the stalemate. So the Western Front is the most important, and neither side can break through the trenches. So here's some very quickly built trenches along a ditch. So they increase the size that the French are using. So these are French soldiers. These are navy blue uniforms, red pants. Here they are entrenched, and this also shows the problems of trenches. It rains a lot there. By the way, the French would keep these awful uniforms until 1916. Red pants and blue top. A rifle by then had a range of a mile. A modern rifle, I'm not saying you hit anything in a mile, but still, a mile. Artillery can fire 16,000, 17,000 yards. 8 to 10 miles, and that's regular artillery. So you got to hide. And how do you hide with red pants? And a blue cap with a red stripe. The Allies wore, the British and the Americans wore khaki, so pretty close to this. The Russians wore brown. The Germans wore gray, dull colors. The French would finally adopt dull colors, light blue. They're going to stick with blue till the end. Those poor French soldiers. So, how do you break the stalemate? Well, what happened is both sides quickly dug in. The realization is, you're out, you're dead. You're out in the open. So hide. Dig in. And thus, this evolved into a massive war of attrition. Both sides were hoping for a breakthrough and they could win the battle one fell swoop. But remember attrition from the Civil War. You killed so many of the enemy they could no longer fight. And World War I was one horrific, bloody battle. They would start calling it things such as the meat grinder, or we're going to bleed them white. So, this is a real, this is a picture from a reconnaissance plane. This is the real deal. These are British and German trenches. Now the Germans, remember, they're going to dig in to hold out. So their trenches are going to be, you know, they're much neater, they're more linear, because they're dug in to stay. The British and French purposely dug their trenches pretty haphazardly, because they're thinking, we're not defending, we got to get out of the trenches and drive them out. They actually purposely made their trenches worse, thinking that the men will want to get out of them to go fight, which is patently ridiculous. That's the kind of thing that only people who weren't in the trenches could think of. You know, old men who weren't going to go fight and die. And so this area would be called no man's land. Now I took this picture because the contrast, you can actually see it. But you can see what's going to happen here is you have the front line trench, support, back line. There might be 4 or 5 lines. There's communication trenches so you can go between them. These are supposed to be shell holes. Inside, I mentioned this before, and they called it at Petersburg. They called this at Petersburg in the Civil War, no man's land between the trenches. In areas of southern France where it's more mountainous, no man's land might be a mile wide. So they were quiet fronts. But in places in central France, they might be 50 yards apart around Belgium. So you can hear the enemy. You can hear them. And they would do raids out in the middle of the night, reconnaissance missions, or engineers would come out at night and string millions of feet of barbed wire. So remember barbed wire was invented in 1879, the West, James Wood. Well, think about what barbed wire does. It's not to stop the enemy. They put it like a big clump of barbed wire here. A big clump of barbed wire here. And if enemies coming towards the barbed wire, what do? They'll kind of funnel them to the open area. And that's where you have your machine guns all lined up. So a lot of the shelling, they would use artillery to try to knock out enemy defenses. They'd also try to blow up the barbed wire, which actually made it worse, just made big piles of it. And in these spots, intermixed would be machine guns that would just put a wave of bullets, they fire about 400 rounds a minute. So not enough like it'd be a constant shield, but you put so many bullets out that you knock men down, and men won't hit the ground, they just can't go anywhere. Oh, and you notice the trenches are jagged. You know why? If it's a straight line trench, somebody can get in the trenches and just fire up and down the trench line. But the other reasons are jagged, the trench line's longer, you can put more men in it. But actually the biggest, if a shell hits right there, it only affects that section of the trench line. It won't blow the whole, like down the line. And so that's a really good picture. And you think if there's any foliage, if this was in a forest, there's no trees left. They're blown away. Absolutely gone. Just nothing but just this dirt and mud and bodies. And so here's a little bit of trench. Here's German forces about ready to go over the top. This is 1918. They have modern helmets. See all this? Stacks of hand grenades. German hand grenades had a handle, so stick with a handle. So the Americans called them potato mashers. Why not? This is a German trench that was taken by the British. This is 1918. That's an American, buried to peek over the parapet. And you can see the step. So these trenches would eventually get 12 feet deep, so you could just walk through and not worry about ducking. And here, this is at Gallipoli. That's a British soldier putting a pith helmet up to see how many bullets would be shot in it by snipers. I showed you that picture from Petersburg in the Civil War, and they would put this up and they would bet how many bullet holes in like 10 seconds. Because there were snipers everywhere. The snipers would have a steel plate in the little cupola, the hole, and you just would scan the line. And with modern rifles, they're acting 500 yards. And so you stick your head up, the odds are you're dead in 5 seconds. And so both sides had snipers, and when I was a little kid, everybody smoked. Everybody smoked. And so I'm talking, you go into a restaurant and there's a big ashtray with a pile of ashes, and everybody's smoking. But cigarettes became the favorite vehicle to deliver this addicting drug, tobacco, in World War I. Makes sense. You're in a trench, it'd be hard to put tobacco in a pipe, have a cigarette. And so cigarettes became popular, and that's why you don't see pictures of people with cigarettes in the 1920s. And when I was a little kid, everybody smoked. My grandparents smoked. I mean, just women were told to smoke while they're pregnant because it helped calm their nerves and ease morning sickness. They're also told to drink too. Not making this up. So just don't think about it. God, just amazing. But anyways, okay, everyone smoked, and I remember this talking to my uncles and my grandparents when we go see them when I was a little kid, and they say things like, when everyone's smoking, so I'm a little kid and everyone's smoking around me, and they would say, never light, it's bad luck to light 3 cigarettes for 1 match. They always would say that. And so they have a match and they light 2, and say, blow it out, can't do that, bad luck. And it's from World War I. So at night, there's snipers everywhere. Night, strike the match, they see the light. So you light the first one, they see it. Light the second one, they aim. Light the third one, they fire. And so that was this thing I remember from a kid. When I first started teaching this a long time ago, people knew that in my class. Don't light 3 cigarettes. Because a lot more people smoke. You guys probably never heard that. Have you? Act like you've heard that, right? Act like. Make me feel only just really old. Okay, so, by the way, snipers were never taken prisoner. They hated snipers so much that they tried to surrender. So, with that. So, a couple more things in trench life. Here's in Belgium, and the soil was really clay, so whenever it rained, the water would sit there for weeks. I can't even imagine the misery of that. Don't even think just, okay, the water. So they have latrine, the bathroom's got it right there, so they're going to flood. There's bodies all over. So you're just soaked, it's just everywhere, just getting into you. We're not even into the worst part of it. Rats are everywhere. Let's be clear about it. These are well-fed rats. And we're not talking little rats. Look at this thing. Those are industrial strength rats. And they're coming for you. So rat killing, these are French soldiers, but every army did it. Killing rats became like a favorite sport as you're sitting in the trench, bored out of your skull, waiting for the next attack, which you would absolutely care. You're German soldiers. Same thing every soldier did. So Americans, when they came in, you go in the trench, no matter how clean you think you are, you're going to be covered with guns. Just covered, head to toe. Crawling life, just the misery of this. So they're picking the nits out of the eggs. Pick them out. What's that? Trench foot. So you've all been in the bath, right? And your skin wrinkles. So you don't get blood circulation. And it doesn't last long. The skin, you get blood circulation when they dry. But if you're like in this for 2 weeks, you won't get a circulation in your skin. And so that means that your skin won't be able to fight off things like a fungus that's in dirt everywhere. There's fungus. You fight it off really easily when blood's circulating. When it's not circulating in those areas, the fungus gets in, and literally begins to eat away your skin or your toes. There's stories of men taking off their shoes when they have trench foot. They know it hurts, and they're scared to death, and they pull their socks off and their boots off, and their toes go with them. And it's not like, oh, my toes are gone. Look at this guy, my toes are gone. No, it hurts really bad. And obviously you can't fight. That's why in the military, in every army in the world, you're on the ground. So something where you're a foot soldier or something where on the ground, the number one offense, we're getting the most trouble in the army. Today, U.S. Army, every army, wet feet. Your feet are wet. That. So that's the big thing, dry feet. And it's one of those, why do you care so much? Oh, I see. I can't even imagine the pain of that. That's a picture I took of the trenches in Belgium. And these trenches, a lot of them are still there. And that's a tunnel they dug into the limestone. They would dig tunnels and try to go underneath the enemy trench and blow them up. And there were tunnel wars at 50 feet below no man's land between the British and, these are British and Germans, but British and the French, or whoever it might be. And if you like bats and like tight spaces, you can go into those tunnels and have bats above you and raining feces on you. Gee, I wonder if diseases might come from that. I'm pondering that as I look at my mask. Bats are really important animals, but there are issues with bats and humans. Moving on, here's a couple guys about ready to go over the top. And you see them fixing their bayonets, even though they rarely ever got close enough to actually use their bayonets. But here's a great picture. That's a British soldier. And what he's doing there is, okay, they would blow whistles because it's the only way to be heard. But he's actually doing this. That's a major insult. Back in 1914, 1915, that was like, you're a something. We'll let you fill into something. So I just think that's so funny. He took the time, machine guns and shells are going on all around him, and he goes, yeah! Why not, right? Well, we're going to go right to, machine guns were one weapon that, even though artillery was the biggest killer, this was the weapon that men, when they had to go over the top, these would put down a wave of bullets, 400 rounds a minute. These are Germans that are staged. So this is a staged photo, but I like this picture. You can see the gas mask, the modern helmets. The machine gun that still heats up, so you see that they pump water into it. Modern machine guns are air-cooled, they're steel. Here's an American gunner firing a French, it's called a Lewis gun. Jammed all the time, but it's a machine gun. And these are Italian soldiers firing a machine gun. And the machine guns put 200 to 400 rounds a minute, just put a line of bullets out. The men hated machine gunners too. They rarely ever took them prisoner. Hated them. Here's another weapon that was brand new in this war. Oh, no, I almost forgot to put this up here. So there were efforts to use machine guns, and I thought they thought they could ride a bike over no man's land. Fire. How's a bike going to go through our barbed wire shell holes? And here's a German one. They thought they could have this steel plate and roll that between the trenches. That's insanity. They can't move, they get bogged down, and think about what a big target. And then mine a rat, jam an explosive inside a rat, and throw it at the enemy. Don't bog yourself down with how they got the explosive in. And I'm not even sure how this would work, but why would you even invent this? And this is one they kind of tried in a few places. And they tried it in World War II also. Put a mine, explosives on the dog. Have the dog run into a machine gun nest and then set off. The Russians tried to do this with having dogs going to German tanks. And the US Navy even experimented with putting bombs on dolphins and having them go on ships. Yeah, just awful. Fortunately, it didn't work, and they didn't do it that many times, but it's just unbelievable. But I thought that, you get desperate, you do crazy things. And so this is a great picture showing the lunacy of this. Here you have modern war. So you have a modern soldier, a modern rifle, modern helmet, gas mask. Yet they still thought cavalry would work. And they're always looking for that opening they could run cavalry through. By the way, horses don't like machine guns. Didn't work very well. And he's holding a lance like it's 1600. And he's going to run down the enemy. And it's just fascinating. So that picture just is startling. But let's not forget artillery is the biggest killer. Artillery, firing high explosive rounds. And like, for example, the French in the beginning of the war, their main artillery was 75mm shells, about that big. And that wasn't big enough. Eventually, you're going to have 155, 205mm, 250mm. That's a 250mm shell that this German is writing, and he's far too happy about it. I'm writing a shell. And these are British. Those are Americans bringing shells to the front. That's a German. They call it the trench mortar kind of log shells. But the point is, it's the explosive shells. High explosives can knock out fortifications, but the big killer, these shells were designed with metal outside. Sometimes they even put like a musket balls inside. But the British officer who devised these metal shells that when it exploded, it turned into 1,000 jagged pieces of metal. His name was, and it blows me away. This is a real person. His name was Colonel Harry Shrapnel. And that's shrapnel that gets blown up. Named after him. And so shells, to this day, are designed to break up into 1,000 red-hot pieces of metal. Some tiny that will pepper you with small but horrific wounds that infect really easy, or jagged pieces that will cut your head off. And that is the biggest killer, the horrible shrapnel. Especially when they started having, as the war went on, they'd fire a shell that would explode just above the ground, so the shrapnel would rain down. Today, they do that now. They could rain it down on people and just cause horrific casualties. It's the big killer. Here's one more weapon they invented during the war, a flamethrower. And I think you can see the problem with the flamethrower, can't you? Okay, they've been using jelly gasoline. You might have heard the Byzantines in 800. They used Greek fire, it's called. But you have jelly gasoline in a tank, high pressure on a nozzle, it's ignited here, it can shoot fire about 50 yards. And the big thing about that is you shoot at like a bunker or a fortification, a jet of flame comes at you. You don't need to be that accurate. If I see fire coming at me, I duck. And it's a good way to kind of, you use that to proceed an attack. So the Germans did it first, here French, the Americans have, the British, everybody. I think you might see the problem with flamethrowers. Highly trained crews, can you imagine the attrition rate of these guys? He's carrying a tank of gasoline. If there's a shell nearby, so these men died really fast. Tanks were invented in World War I. Tanks there was a meaningless code word the British invented to hide what it was. They were thinking about a land battleship that could go over no man's land with armored sides. And so they acted like it was, they disguised it as saying it was just going to be something to bring tanks of water to the men. So that's like when we have the word tank. This is the most common tank. The British would use this. And they were big monstrosities, but their engines weren't big enough, so the armor was so thin, it really didn't provide that much protection. And even though by the end of the war they would use these by the thousands, they only moved about 2 to 3 miles an hour. They get stuck in a trench and just kind of be stuck there. They weren't as decisive as they hoped, but people could see the potential. Here's a French one that's closer to a modern tank. And this French tank, a Renault, and the Americans are using it. So these are Americans. And the Germans built a few, but they didn't have enough resources. And these things moved about 1 mile an hour. They were 25 tons, and they broke down all the time. So, but the Germans were banned tanks after the war. And we've all been through this. There's something that, someone says, you can't have that. And what's the first thing you want? That thing. And so people thought, boy, tanks must have been a more important part of the victory for the Allies than we thought. So everybody wanted tanks out. The last thing I'll tell you about is, this would be the beginning of airplanes. We jump right to this. Orville and Wilbur Wright flew their first plane in 1903, but it was mostly the French who were leading air technology. And the Italians used it against the Turks for the first time in 1911. But the big thing was this. Planes did reconnaissance. For the first time, you could fly over the enemy and see what they're doing. If you think about camouflage, And they worry so much about camouflage today, it came out of World War I because they could fly over and see you. Before it didn't matter. And it's an easy step to, hey, we're flying over them, let's drop grenades, bombers. And I don't want them flying over me. Fighter planes shoot them down. But it's going to take a while. There'll be a few planes in 1915, 1916, but massive technological developments that will lead to, by 1918, 1,000 planes in the sky. And so that is the British company, or the German company was called Fokker DR1, the Red Baron flew that. Baron over top and shot down 8 planes. Fokker DR7. This is Americans. There's a SPAD 13, but this French plane. Americans use almost all French weapons. And the Southwest Camel. That's what Snoopy flew. Is the Red Baron. So planes. That we have so beginning of class, we're watching the killing fields. Any questions on the map you can ask tomorrow or Monday? Sound good? Woo! I have so many little stories to tell you on this, but I'm always kind of censoring myself. I can't tell you everything. Please click the brain.